Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Keith Sullivan. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Keith Dwayne Sullivan was born in the early 1970s and lived in Grove Oak, Alabama. This rural farming community is 97 miles north of Birmingham. Keith was the owner of a music school and had once been a professor of music. He was also a music director at his church. Keith had a neighbor named Gregory Mark Bagwell, who went by the name Greg. He lived in a trailer, which he did not own. It's not clear if Greg rented it or was simply permitted to stay there for free. Members of the community and of law enforcement were very familiar with Greg. He had an extensive criminal history, which involved drugs, arson, reckless endangerment, shooting at his neighbors' homes, and shooting at the police. In 2015, Greg was involved in a standoff with the police and repeatedly fired a weapon at them for about 30 minutes. He was arrested after a SWAT team fired tear gas into his residence. Sometime around 2022, Greg set fire to the trailer that he lived in. In 2023, he was arrested for possessing methamphetamine and drug paraphernalia. In April 2023, he called the police and reported that a deputy and a district attorney were at his home. He claimed that everybody in the home had been shot. Greg was arrested for rendering false alarm. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On May 5, 2023, Greg Bagwell was released on bond. 2 days later, on May 7, neighbors heard shots coming from Greg's trailer. The police were called and arrived sometime around 6:30 p.m. They were not able to locate Greg. At 12:30 a.m., now on May 8, 2023, Greg's neighbor Keith Sullivan called the police. At this time, Greg was destroying his own property. He was banging on his trailer with a pipe or something like that. Greg was yelling about not going to jail, and at one point, directing his rage at Keith's house, Greg yelled, "I will get you." The police arrived at about 1 a.m. They spoke to Greg, and he specifically inquired if it was the married couple across the street who called 911. Greg was referring to Keith Sullivan and his wife. He falsely accused his neighbors of conducting assaults of a sexual nature against him all day. Perhaps Greg was delusional and/or paranoid. Before the police left the area at about 1:20 a.m., they stopped by Keith's house for a few minutes. Greg could see what they were doing because Keith's house was not that far away. In case there was any mystery about who had called the police, it was now removed. Greg knew the call came from someone in the Sullivan family house. 3 people were in the house at this time: Keith Sullivan, his wife, and his 16-year-old daughter. 40 minutes later, at 2 a.m., Keith saw Greg on his video surveillance system. Greg was lurking outside the house and holding something in his hand, which was later determined to be a lighter. Keith told his wife to call 911, then went to the front porch and confronted Greg Bagwell. During this confrontation, Keith shot and killed Greg. Referring to Greg, Keith told a 911 operator, quote, "He turned and I thought he was going for something. He said, 'I'm leaving, but he turned at that time, and I thought he was maybe going for something,' unquote." The police arrived on the scene. Here's what they found during the course of their investigation. The entire confrontation between Keith and Greg lasted for only 13 seconds. Keith Sullivan had discharged his weapon 8 times and struck Greg 7 times. Greg was struck 4 times in his back, once in his abdomen, once in the left side of his torso, and once in the arm. Greg did not have a weapon in his possession when he was shot. Keith spoke to the police. He told them that he was afraid Greg was there to seek revenge because he had called the police on him. He was also aware that Greg had a bad reputation, like shooting at people and being arrested. Keith said, quote, "I took my pistol, went out there. When I went out there, that's when he turned like this," unquote. About 9 months later, on February 15, 2024, Keith Sullivan was indicted for murder. He applied for immunity under the Stand Your Ground law in Alabama, but was denied. His trial started on March 5, 2025. 6 days later, on March 11, the judge declared a mistrial because the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The state indicated that they intend to try Keith Sullivan again. At the time I'm making this video, the trial is scheduled for October 2025. Now moving to my analysis. Keith Sullivan maintains his innocence, and he has a massive number of supporters. They argue that Keith never should have been charged in the first place, and that his prosecution is nothing short of ridiculous and reckless. It sends a chilling message to anyone who is confronted by a violent individual that if they defend themselves, they will be prosecuted. The attorney representing Keith also represented Daniel Penny. Daniel had been charged with manslaughter in connection with killing a homeless man named Jordan Neely on a New York City subway in 2023. In December 2024, Daniel was found not guilty. Many of Keith's supporters see a parallel between the two cases. Both Keith and Daniel were falsely accused of a crime when they were actually defending themselves. The state, of course, disagrees. They argue that Greg Bagwell started retreating from the front porch of Keith's house when Keith produced the pistol. This brings me to the question, was Keith Sullivan guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Greg was outside of Keith's house when the confrontation occurred. He was unarmed and made no attempt to break in. Greg told Keith he was leaving, backed up, and turned to his right as if he was walking away. This is when Keith fired on him. Of the 7 times Greg was struck, 4 times were in his back. Greg was carrying a lighter, which could be considered a weapon in light of Greg's arson history. However, the danger posed by the lighter was to the house. There was no way that Greg was going to set the house on fire while walking away. He wasn't carrying a flamethrower. It was just a lighter. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Greg Bagwell was a violent individual who was well known to law enforcement. He had a history of posting anti-law enforcement messages on social media. Greg's neighbors considered him to be deranged and said he terrorized the community for years. He was even banned from the local gas station due to his erratic behavior. Over the years, Greg had proved himself to be capable of committing a wide variety of crimes, including arson and shooting at homes. His criminal record was extensive. Keith Sullivan was Greg's neighbor. He was a productive member of the community and did not have a criminal record. Keith did not even have any traffic violations. Keith was familiar with Greg's bad behavior, having witnessed it for some time. Greg was the reason that Keith had a video surveillance system at his house. He was aware that Greg had once set fire to the trailer he lived in. Keith not only had to consider how Greg was a threat to his safety, but a danger to his wife and teenage daughter. Late on May 7 and into early May 8, 2023, Greg appeared to be in a bad mood. He was extremely disruptive, banging on his trailer and yelling. At one point, Greg threatened to kill Keith Sullivan and his family when he yelled, "I will get you." Keith called the police at 12:30 a.m. on May 8. Before they left the area, the police stopped by his house, which meant that Greg knew for certain who called the police on him. Greg had specifically expressed an interest in finding out this information. At about 2 a.m., Greg came over to Keith's house and was lurking around. He had a lighter in his hand. When considering this in light of Greg's history of arson, it is reasonable to believe that he may have intended to set fire to Keith's house. This meant the lighter could be considered a deadly weapon. It was slow-acting, but deadly nonetheless. The circumstances compelled Keith to confront Greg, because failing to do so may have resulted in the death of Keith and his family. Keith had every right to protect himself from any type of harm, including harm caused by fire. When Keith confronted him, Greg said something like, "I thought you invited me here. I thought you said I could take one of your cars." Keith knew this statement was not true. He was not friends with Greg. He did not give permission for Greg to take a car or even to be on his property. The fact that Greg was deceptive only reinforced the idea that he was there for some type of nefarious purpose. Greg indicated that he was leaving, but then, as he was turning to his right, he quickly reached down toward his waistband with his left hand. This was captured by video surveillance. It was only at this time that Keith opened fire. Keith fired his weapon 8 times and struck Greg 7 times. 4 of those shots were in the back. However, this confrontation happened quickly. If Greg had a gun, as Keith suspected based on seeing him reach for his waistband, Greg would have still been a threat, even as he moved away. Greg was unarmed, but he did have that lighter, as I mentioned, and he had a hairbrush protruding from his back pocket, which may have looked like a firearm. Considering Greg's questionable commitment to personal hygiene, no one would have suspected it was a hairbrush. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Keith Sullivan was guilty of murder? I do not believe that Keith should have opened fire on Greg. It was not a good decision. Even so, I believe that Keith was not guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt. Greg's behavior caused Keith to fear for his safety and the safety of his family. Yelling the words, "I will get you," at a family, and then stepping on their front porch at 2 a.m. are behaviors that cause people to be afraid for their lives. Greg provoked the situation, and unfortunately, he was killed. This is one of those cases where a career criminal pushed his luck too far. Greg would have been much safer in prison, where he belonged, but the criminal justice system was unable or unwilling to put him there. Not only was he the target of 2 911 calls in the hours leading up to his death, his bond had been revoked. Greg should have been arrested. The mystery here is why the state decided to prosecute Keith Sullivan. Realistically, it's hard to imagine him being convicted of murder. I would guess that the jury struggled with manslaughter, but even this charge is a stretch, considering the evidence. Keith may have acted in a more extreme manner than some people would have, but that doesn't automatically mean his behavior was unreasonable or criminal. The state's argument was based on the idea that Greg was a bad person, but he deserved to be treated the same as a good person. That's a fine argument, but Keith did not shoot Greg because he was a bad person. He shot him because he thought Greg was going to kill him. The state made a mistake with this prosecution, but they will never admit it. They are committed to a path of nonsense, much like the victim, in their case, Greg, was committed to a life of crime. Those are my thoughts on the case of Keith Sullivan. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.